Elvis Sutphin fell in love with the female college student we had been sponsoring together. In order to marry her, he broke ties with his parents and insisted on breaking off our engagement. Later, the female college student disappeared, and Elvis changed his mind and married me. 10 years later, my company was taken over by the Sutphin family, my parents passed away, and Elvis had me committed to a mental hospital. This is your retribution for breaking up Tanya and me. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself back 10 years ago, on the day Elvis wanted to break off our engagement. Facing Elvis's parents who refused to annul the engagement, I smiled and said, "Since the two of them truly love each other, Mr. and Mrs. Sutphin, please let them be together. As for my engagement with Elvis, let's annul it here and now in front of everyone." When Elvis came to see me, I had been tortured out of shape, unable to tell if I was really ill or not. As soon as he appeared, I hurriedly rushed towards him, wanting to ask why he was treating me this way. Unfortunately, before I could get close, I was tripped by the iron chain on my ankle. My head hit right by Elvis's feet, making me look extremely pathetic. The doctor who came in with Elvis explained, "Miss Jones is severely ill and always tries to escape, so we had to chain her." While speaking, he carefully observed Elvis's expression, afraid of offending this man who now stood at the pinnacle of North City. But Elvis acted as if he hadn't heard him, maintaining the same expression he had when he entered, looking down at me condescendingly. After a long while, I heard him speak. "Cecily Jones. Living a life worse than death isn't pleasant, is it? Why?" I raised my head and asked him. With just a glance from Elvis, everyone else tactfully left the room. Once it was just the two of us, he slowly squatted down in front of me with a cruel smile on his lips. He said, "This is your retribution for breaking up Tanya and me, Tanya." I thought for a long time before recalling a vague figure. So, he had never forgotten Tanya Kieran all these years. "Back then, you forced Tanya away and made me marry you, Cecily. You never thought you'd end up like this, did you?" Elvis's hard-soled shoe pressed down on my hand, grinding it. I winced in pain. Back then, Tanya Kern clearly left after taking money for Mrs. Sutphin, so how did it become my fault for driving her away? Moreover, later on, it was Elvis and his parents who came to my home to ask for the marriage. It was clearly you and your parents who begged me to marry you. When did I ever force you? I didn't know which word in my sentence angered him, but Elvis suddenly reached out and strangled my neck. "If I didn't marry you, would your dad have helped the Sutphin family through the crisis? If this isn't forcing, what is?" My father's wholehearted assistance turned into coercion in his eyes. "So you maliciously took over my father's company, causing my family to be ruined?" I looked at Elvis in disbelief. After Tanya left, Elvis knelt in front of me and admitted his mistake, begging for my forgiveness for his momentary lapse in judgment. I thought he had truly repented, so I remembered our childhood friendship, forgave him, and agreed to marry him. Today is Tanya's death anniversary. Elvis's hand around my neck suddenly tightened. Was Tanya already dead? "Cecily Jones, go and atone for your sins to her." Under Elvis's orders, they had been forcibly medicating me for some time. Even now, no matter how unwilling I was, I couldn't muster any strength to resist. If only I could go back 10 years. I thought this as I lost consciousness. The moment I saw Elvis ration with Tanya, I realized that I had been reborn. In my previous life, he did the same thing. At Mr. Sutphin's birthday banquet, without caring about anyone's face, he directly brought Tanya in front of me. He said, "Cecily Jones, Tanya and I are truly in love, so I want to break off my engagement with you." I hadn't recovered from the shock of my rebirth and could only stare blankly at Elvis Sutphin's determined face. It was Mrs. Sutphin, who was standing next to me, that pulled me back. She frowned and stood between me and Elvis, speaking sternly. "Today is your father's birthday banquet. What nonsense are you causing in front of so many guests? I want to break off my engagement with Cecily." The large banquet hall suddenly became silent, and everyone was staring at Elvis. Everything was exactly the same as in my previous life. My parents gave the Sutphin family one last bit of dignity by not causing a scene, and instead asked Elvis, "Elvis, do you know what you're saying?" Elvis turned to look at Tanya, who was cowering beside him, and said solemnly, "Mr. Jones, I don't love Cecily. I want to break off my engagement with her." As soon as he finished speaking, Mr. Sutphin rushed over and slapped Elvis across the face. "You ungrateful brat, if you keep talking nonsense, I'll beat you to death right here." No one dared to intervene. Seeing that Mr. Sutphin was about to strike again, my father stopped him. "Mr. Sutphin." My father glanced at me and continued, "Since your son is unwilling, let's forget about it. A forced melon is not sweet, and our Cecily is not unmarriageable. This engagement. In my previous life, my parents were not satisfied with this marriage. It was only because my grandfather had arranged it and they thought I liked Elvis that they didn't say anything. Now, with the Sutphin family publicly proposing to break off the engagement, they were naturally more than willing. But Elvis's parents disagreed. This is a marriage arranged by our parents. Elvis's nonsense cannot be taken seriously. Mrs. Sutphin knew that my parents had always looked down on Elvis, so she turned to persuade me. "Cecily, you and Elvis have been together for so many years. You can't just end it like this. Don't worry. Leave this matter to me. I will definitely give you an explanation." Indeed, in my previous life, it was Mrs. Sutphin who stepped in, using threats and bribes, and eventually gave Tanya $2 million to make her leave Y City. But 10 years later, Elvis blamed me and my parents for not being able to be with Tanya. Thinking of the resentment from my previous life, I lowered my eyes and brushed off Mrs. Sutphin's hand. "Mrs. Sutphin, since Elvis says they are truly in love, you should let them be together. As for my engagement with Elvis..." I glanced at the surprised Elvis and said firmly, "As for my engagement with Elvis, let's break it off in front of everyone today." The voice was not loud, but everyone present heard it clearly. Mrs. Sutphin wanted to persuade me, but my mother stopped her. "Since your son wants to break off the engagement and our Cecily agrees, then it's settled." After saying that, they took me away. On the way, my parents said many comforting words to me. Looking at my parents, whom I hadn't seen for a long time, my nose tingled and I couldn't help but cry. My father, just like when I was a child, held me in his arms. "Don't cry, don't cry. Our Cecily should always be happy. It's just a man. Dad will find you a better one in the future." They all thought I was sad because of Elvis. Only I knew that I was grateful that heaven favored me and gave me a chance to be reborn, allowing me to see my parents again. As soon as we got home, my father mysteriously went into the study. Passing by the study, I heard him talking on the phone, seemingly mentioning me. Even though I was reborn, I still had the same nightmares from my previous life. Early in the morning, I woke up from a nightmare. When I came out of my bedroom, I heard the doorbell ringing. Opening the door, a familiar yet strange man stood outside. Even though his almost perfect face was still familiar, his aura was completely different from when he was 18. "Uncle Garrett?" I said in surprise. Garrett Black was also stunned for a long time when he saw me. Hearing me call him, he smiled slightly. "Why have you become so obedient? You never used to call me that before." Garrett Black was called to the study by my dad. When my mom asked me to bring some fruit, I overheard him saying, "I arrived around 4 in the morning. The old house wasn't ready, so I came straight here. I knew you wake up early, so I dared to disturb you. I just didn't expect it would be Cecily who opened the door." My dad frowned, looking somewhat displeased. "You waited outside for more than 3 hours? Why didn't you knock? We have guest rooms." Seeing me standing outside the door, my dad suddenly stopped talking. "This is Garrett Black, your grandpa's best friend's youngest son. Do you remember him?" he asked me. Seeing me nod, my dad's smile suddenly turned meaningful. "Good that you remember." Breakfast was prepared by the housemaid. At the dining table, my parents kept asking Garrett how he had been living abroad these years. With my elder brother and elder sister around, you know my brother's temper. Garrett smiled helplessly, composed and elegant. I had no impression of Garrett's elder brother. After his father passed away, almost everyone in the Black family went abroad. Only Garrett insisted on staying in North City to finish high school. But his father had him in his later years, and his family doted on Garrett, especially his elder brother and elder sister. So, over the years, Garrett should have lived well abroad. Just as my dad was about to ask something else, the maid came in and said there were guests. It's the Sutphin couple with their son. As soon as the maid finished speaking, Mrs. Sutphin had already come in. Cecily, it was Elvis's fault yesterday. We brought him to apologize to you. My parents' friendly demeanor from earlier, when facing Garrett, turned stern, and they told them to leave. This matter is over. No need for apologies. Mrs. Sutphin walked over to me. They've been in love for so many years. How can it just end like this? Cecily, I knows you genuinely like Elvis.
Look.
Before she could finish, Elvis, who had followed in, saw Garrett and suddenly asked me, "Why is he back?" Everyone's eyes turned to Garrett simultaneously. My dad coughed twice, displeased. Garrett is a guest of our family. He glanced at Elvis, then turned to look at Mr.
Sutphin.
Mr. Sutphin, it was your Elvis who publicly broke off the engagement. We made everything clear in front of everyone yesterday. Words once spoken cannot be taken back. This engagement is void. I think there's no need for apologies. We have guests. Please leave. My dad's firm attitude and harsh words left Elvis's parents in an awkward position. The atmosphere became tense and awkward. I just got back and have some things to deal with. I'll visit another day. Garrett looked at his watch, then stood up and said to my dad. In my memory, he was always like this. Despite being pampered growing up, Garrett never showed any signs of arrogance. Instead, he was more well-mannered and knew when to advance and retreat. Given the current situation at my house, it was indeed inappropriate for him to stay. My dad went to see Garrett out, and Elvis looked at me with a complex expression, his tone somewhat harsh. We just broke off the engagement yesterday, and Garrett is back today. Quick move. How this remark made me recall events from long ago. I always felt that before Tanya appeared, Elvis might have loved me. He used to get jealous when other boys were around me. When I said I wanted to eat wontons at night, he would search all over North City for them. But all those past events are now bygones, and now Tanya has replaced me as the person Elvis cares about most. Mrs. Sutphin, you should go back. Elvis has found his true love, and I genuinely wish him well. I ignored Elvis, pulling my hand out of Mrs. Sutphin's grasp. Just as I was about to turn and go upstairs, I heard Elvis shout behind me. Cecily, do you think I came to beg you today? Do you think I wanted to come? Besides having a good background and good parents, what else do you have over Tanya? I frowned and turned around, not understanding why he suddenly said these things. Before I could speak, Mr. Sutphin's slap had already landed on Elvis's face. Did you forget what you promised your mom and me before coming here? You all heard it. Cecily has made up her mind to sever ties with our family. Elvis shouted, holding his neck stiffly. If that's the case, why do you still force me to beg her? Why not let me marry Tanya? Besides her background, what does Tanya lack compared to Cecily? Watching Elvis make a fool of himself, I suddenly started to laugh. I curved my lips. Yes, Mr. and Mrs. Sutphin. They truly love each other. You should just let them be together. In my past life, Elvis blamed me for standing in the way, preventing him and Tanya from having a good ending. In this life, I want to see if without me, they can truly live happily ever after. My words undoubtedly added fuel to the fire. Not only did Mr. Sutphin want to hit him in front of everyone, but even Mrs. Sutphin started scolding him. At this moment, a figure suddenly rushed in from outside. The housemaid tried to stop her, but failed. I recognized her as Tanya Kern. She came up and shielded Elvis. Mr. and Mrs. Sutphin, it's all my fault. If you want to hit someone, hit me. It's my foolishness for loving Elvis. I'm sorry, it's all my fault. Then she turned to me. Miss Jones, please forgive me. Elvis did nothing wrong. It's all my fault. I couldn't control my heart. I coldly watched Tanya pretending to be pitiful in front of me, saying nothing. This farce became more and more ridiculous, and my mom couldn't stand it any longer. She directly called the security from the community to come and expel them. The affair between Elvis and me had become the talk of North City. There were plenty of people gossiping behind our backs. Even at a press conference, the way people looked at me was different. It wasn't until Elvis showed up at the press conference with Tanya that the attention shifted slightly. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw staff leading the two of them towards me. I glanced up at the seating arrangement made by the organizers. Indeed, Elvis's seat was in the same row as mine, with only one seat in between. This row was at the front, considered the main seats of the press conference. After Elvis sat down, Tanya also prepared to sit beside him. I raised an eyebrow and smiled, saying nothing. Sure enough, the next moment, a staff member stopped her. "Miss, this is the main seat area. Please go to the guest seats in the back." The staff member's voice wasn't loud, but it was enough for those of us sitting nearby to hear. When Elvis and Tanya came over, everyone's eyes were already on them. Now, with this happening, people were even more interested in watching the drama unfold. Tanya stood awkwardly, feeling at a loss under everyone's gaze, quickly explaining for herself. "I came with Elvis." The staff member politely said, "Mr. Sutphin didn't inform us in advance that he would bring someone over. All the seats in this row are taken. Please go to the back and find a seat." Tanya still didn't move, clutching the hem of her dress and looking at Elvis. In the dim light, you could still see the sparkle at the corners of Tanya's eyes, not sure if it was decoration or tears from being scared. Elvis stood beside her, comforting her in a low voice, seemingly asking her to sit at the back first. It's my first time at such an occasion. I'm scared without you by my side." Tanya glanced at me, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Then sit here." Elvis had already softened, pulling Tanya to sit down. The staff member spoke again. "Mr. Sutphin, the seat is already taken. Please don't make things difficult for us." The people around started whispering. "What's this woman thinking? Doesn't she know her place? Trying to take the main seat? Not even married yet, and she already thinks she's Mrs. Sutphin." I could hear these comments, and so could Elvis and Tanya. Tanya stopped her movements, and even Elvis looked embarrassed. I said nothing, not even looking at them, just sitting quietly in my seat. But someone just couldn't stand me staying out of it. Elvis suddenly called my name, "Cecily. What are you smiling at?" I turned my head in confusion. Was I smiling? I hadn't noticed. Maybe I just couldn't help it. Tanya is here for the first time. It's understandable she didn't know.
Oh.
I nodded. "It's Tanya's first time attending. Is it your first time too? You love her so much. Why didn't you tell her in advance to avoid making her look foolish?" Elvis's face grew darker, and just as he was about to say something, the lights in the venue suddenly brightened. There was a commotion at the entrance, and everyone looked over, including me. The person entering was Garrett, dressed in a refined and proper suit, looking completely different from when he appeared at my doorstep the other day. Seeing him walk over, many of North City's elites approached him to chat. Even though the Black family's main business had moved abroad, they still held a unique status in North City. Garrett maintained a polite but distant smile. In a moment when he raised his eyes, our gazes met. I was slightly stunned, then smiled politely and pretended nothing had happened, looking away. Elvis and Tanya were still standing there. The staff member spoke again. "Mr. Sutphin, please have this lady go to the back and find a seat." As he spoke, Garrett had already approached. He glanced at Elvis and Tanya standing there. Then he walked straight to me, extending his hand. "Cecily, long time no see." I assumed he was treating me specially out of respect for my father. The staff member was still urging Tanya to leave. When I turned to look, Elvis was staring blankly at the hands clasped together between Garrett and me. Someone joked, "Elvis, if you don't want to make her uncomfortable, just accompany her to the guest seats in the back." Unexpectedly, Elvis really took her to the back. I sneered inwardly. He truly liked Tanya. But moving from the main seat to the guest seat was simple. Trying to get back to the main seat later wouldn't be so easy. Garrett's appearance at the press conference had everyone speculating about why he returned to the country. I asked my dad. The Black family's business is all abroad, so why did Garrett suddenly come back now? My dad gave me a meaningful look. If he wants to come back, he comes back. Why do you care so much? As if suddenly thinking of something, he sat down next to me and stared at me, asking why. Do you care about him a lot? I shook my head. No, I'm just a bit curious. In my memory, in my past life, Garrett didn't return to the country at this time. I only remember that on the day I married Elvis, my dad received a phone call, and afterward he seemed a bit distracted during the wedding. It was much later that I heard from others that Garrett had passed away. Speaking of which, the day he had his accident was the same day as your wedding to Elvis. My rebirth seemed to have indeed changed many things. I broke off my engagement with Elvis, and Garrett didn't die on my wedding day. That weekend, my parents invited Garrett over for dinner. During dinner, they joked about Garrett and me when we were kids. Back then, we wanted Cecily to call you uncle, but she just wouldn't. Garrett smiled and glanced at me. Now she can call me that. Garrett is only a year older than me, and we used to play together a lot as kids, so calling him uncle was indeed hard for me. I was just a kid, I responded casually. My dad was in a good mood and had drunk some wine, so he was chattier than usual. When you were little, you were all about looks. You thought Garrett was good-looking and stuck to him every day, even saying you wanted to marry him. Everyone laughed at that. Garrett pressed his lips together, his eyes full of amusement. A blush spread across my face, reaching my earlobes. I wasn't embarrassed by my dad's words. Instead, I silently praised my younger self for having good taste. Garrett is indeed very handsome, both as a child and now. After dinner, my parents asked me to see Garrett off. But on the way, we ran into Elvis and Tanya. Elvis lived in the same neighborhood as us, and they were standing outside the Sutphin family's villa, looking like they had just come out. I heard Tanya sobbing softly. Your parents look down on me. They think I'm just a poor student from the poor family. They like Cecily Jones. They think only Cecily is good enough for you. Elvis was patiently comforting her, but his words were stepping on me. Cecily just got lucky being born into a good family. She's hypocritical and pretentious. Besides her family background, she's got nothing on you. Tanya's mood seemed to improve. Really? But everyone says Cecily is prettier than me. I don't think so. Cecily's looks are just average. To me, you're the prettier one. Unconsciously, Garrett and I had stopped standing there listening to Elvis and Tanya belittling me. We weren't far from Elvis. He soon noticed me. Cecily. Elvis looked at me, then at Garrett standing beside me. It's so late. What are you two doing together? With Garrett there, I didn't want to argue with Elvis in front of him. When I reached out to pull Garrett away, he didn't move. I thought Mr. Sutphin had poor eyesight and couldn't see us. This was the first time I heard Garrett speak to someone in such an unfriendly tone. He glanced at me, then at Tanya. If you have eye problems, go see a doctor, Elvis. With that, he bent down, took my hand, and walked past Elvis and Tanya. After we had walked a bit, I heard Tanya crying again. Elvis was still comforting her, but his tone was slightly irritated. We walked a bit further before Garrett let go of my hand. Sorry, I knew he was apologizing for holding my hand earlier. It's okay. I waved it off nonchalantly. It was a month later when we found out Tanya was pregnant. That woman even has a child now. Shouldn't the Sutphin family let her in? I think it will happen soon. The two people talking were female companions brought by Garrett's friends. At this time, I was sitting on the sofa in the club, half-heartedly listening to their conversation. Only I knew that the Sutphin family's financial problems were gradually becoming apparent, and there was no way Elvis's parents would let Tanya in. They were still counting on my Jones family to help them out. When Garrett placed a dessert in front of me, a few people at the poker table behind us let out a burst of ambiguous laughter. Garrett, we've been waiting for you, and you were just getting dessert for Miss Jones? Don't I have any waiters here? These people included some rich kids who had just returned to the country and some old acquaintances of Garrett in North City. While they chatted, I ate the dessert Garrett had brought me, but my ears were always attuned to their conversation. Hearing them mention the Sutphin family, I couldn't help but smile. I thought it was worth my effort to get close to Garrett, to show him goodwill, and let him bring me into this circle. The Sutphin family somehow got the news and has already contacted people for my company. Hearing this, I put down my spoon. Garrett, who had been chatting with them, immediately looked up at me. Seeing the dessert barely touched, he asked me, "Don't like it?" I shook my head. I'm cutting back on sugar lately. He nodded and had someone take it away. His friends were calling him over to play cards, but Garrett didn't go immediately. Instead, he turned to me and asked, "Want to play cards?" I looked into his eyes, pretending to hesitate for a moment. "I don't know how." "No problem. I'll teach you." Garrett led me to the card table and sat down. "If you lose, it's on me. If you win, it's yours." As soon as he finished speaking, those people started laughing again. "All on Garrett? Then let's play big." Garrett seemed to be waiting for this remark, and he looked up at the speaker. "How about we bet on the deal between your family and the Sutphen family?" He smiled nonchalantly, but his light words left the people at the table a bit shocked. "If we win, the Sutphen family's deal goes to the Jones family. If I lose, I'll give you the project I mentioned a few days ago." Jesus. The person opposite me stared at Garrett in disbelief. "The Sutphen family deal is only a few million, but your project is worth over $1 billion. Hearing this, I was also stunned. But Garrett still had an indifferent expression. He smiled and asked the other party bet or not. The other party glanced at me. "Bet. If Garrett dares to use $1 billion project to make a beauty smile, what's the Sutphen family's deal?" Thinking about Garrett's $1 billion project, my hand holding the cards trembled a bit. Garrett seemed to notice and bent down to whisper in my ear, "Don't worry, just play. Luckily, we won in the end." I can't believe I lost this. The person across the table threw the cards back on the table. Garrett lowered his eyes to look at me, just smiled without speaking, his expression still very calm. I, however, breathed a sigh of relief. When the Sutphen family's deal was mentioned again, I smiled and spoke up. "Don't worry, the Sutphen family's promise is the same as the Jones family's. We won't let you lose out on this deal." As I left the club, I saw Elvis staggering out of the hotel next door. I happened to know the person coming out with him. He was a manager from the company of the man who had been sitting opposite me earlier. Elvis was all smiles and personally saw the manager off to his car. When he turned around, he saw me and froze for a moment. Tanya, who was standing beside Elvis, noticed his reaction and looked over as well. She whispered something in Elvis's ear, and the two of them left together. "The Sutphen family is bound to be ruined by Elvis Sutphen," someone scoffed. "Taking a pregnant woman along for business talks. What a lack of propriety. You don't know? Nowadays, that young master of the Sutphen family takes that woman with him everywhere." After they left, I heard the remaining people sneer. The next morning, on my way to the company, I received a call from Elvis. "Cecily, did you do it on purpose?" I curved my lips into a smile. "Isn't this how business works?" This was the exact phrase Elvis had said to me in my past life when he maliciously took over my company. Now, I was giving it back to him word for word. "You're targeting me and the Sutphen family just because I broke off our engagement? I'm really glad I broke off the engagement with you back then. The thought of spending my life with someone like you makes me sick," Elvis said, his tone a bit frantic. "Is that so?" I retorted with a cold laugh. "Given the current situation of the Sutphen family, do I even need to target you? Elvis, do you think a single business deal can revive the Sutphen family? You're too naive. I suggest you go home and find out the real situation of the Sutphen family first." What a joke. If a single business deal could save the Sutphen family, then in my past life, Elvis's parents wouldn't have desperately forced him to marry me. I think after Tanya disappeared in my past life, Elvis compromised and came to beg for my forgiveness, probably because he had realized the situation of the Sutphen family. Elvis's parents only confessed the situation of the Sutphen family after our marriage. And in the end, my father, for my sake, exhausted everything to barely save the Sutphen family from the brink of bankruptcy. But later, when Elvis gained power, the first thing he did was maliciously take over my company. On the phone, Elvis suddenly fell silent, and after a long time, he asked, "Then why did you take away this business deal?" "Why?" "Because I wanted Elvis to experience the despair my family went through in my past life. I wanted him to watch hope gradually slip away. I wanted him to feel the same rage I felt when my family was driven to the brink of bankruptcy." And my father, after drinking himself into a stomach hemorrhage, managed to secure a business deal, only for it to be snatched away by Elvis the next day. I didn't answer and hung up the phone directly. Given the current situation of the Sutphin family, if I wanted to take advantage of their plight, they would have to declare bankruptcy by tomorrow. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to see Elvis struggle desperately. I wanted him to understand that even without me, Cecily Jones, standing in their way, he and Tanya would never end well. The next time I saw Elvis was at a charity gala. It had been a few months since we last met, and he had lost a lot of weight. He seemed different from before. I was surprised not to see Tanya by his side this time. When Elvis saw me, he was visibly stunned, his eyes filled with complex emotions. He approached me and started a conversation, his tone markedly different from before. Long time no see. I didn't want to engage with him, but Elvis continued talking. You never used to like attending these kinds of events. There were few times I asked you to accompany me and you refused. I frowned. The memories were too distant. I seemed to have forgotten what he was talking about. You're here with Garrett Black, right? Elvis suddenly shifted the topic to Garrett. Annoyed, I responded with a curtain, then turned and met Garrett's gaze. Garrett had been smiling until he saw Elvis standing beside me. I didn't know what he whispered to the person next to him, but that person also turned to look at me. Then Garrett strode towards me. I put down my wine glass, ignoring the still chatting Elvis, and walked towards Garrett. For some reason, I felt that Garrett seemed upset. When we sat in the VIP section prepared by the organizers, this feeling became even more apparent. Previously, whenever we attended such events together, Garrett's attention was always on me. But now, he had been talking to the person next to him for a long time, as if deliberately avoiding looking at me. I coughed lightly. Garrett sighed softly, raised his hand to ask a staff member for a cup of hot water. If your throat is uncomfortable, don't drink alcohol. When I took the hot water, I asked him, Garrett, are you upset? Garrett neither confirmed nor denied it. He simply said, I don't have the right to be upset right now. A puzzling statement, but I suddenly understood. That person behind you has been staring at you for a long time. Aren't you going to say something to him? His tone was obviously tinged with jealousy. I didn't need to turn around to know he was talking about Elvis, who had been watching me. Elvis was sitting in the regular guest section, a considerable distance away from me. Throughout the gala, Elvis was either looking at me or seizing opportunities to talk to a foreigner. I knew that foreigner well. He was a notable figure in the investment banking world. In my previous life, after the Sutphin family disclosed their situation, my father went to great lengths to connect with this overseas investor to get him to help the Sutphin family. I hadn't expected Elvis to approach him on his own in this life. A sudden thought flashed through my mind. Seeing me staring over there, Garrett also glanced in that direction. He then asked, Mr. Hobbs is a friend of mine. Do you want to meet him? I withdrew my gaze and looked at Garrett beside me. I intentionally got close to you before, hoping you would introduce me to your friends. You must have noticed that. Garrett chuckled and nodded. Now I want to meet that overseas investor. Are you willing to take me over? He still nodded, his eyes soft and loving, even his smile indulgent. Of course I am. I frowned, staring at him for a long time before asking the question in my heart. Garrett, do you like me? Thinking about Elvis's unusual behavior that day. While chatting with a friend, I asked, how are Elvis and Tanya doing? Is the Sutphin family still not allowing her in? My friend paused, perhaps surprised that I brought up Elvis. After Tanya lost the baby, Elvis kicked her out of North City. What? I hadn't heard about that. Because of your relationship with Elvis, everyone is afraid to mention it in front of you. The Sutphin family's business had problems, and Elvis was extremely busy during that time. Tanya kept causing trouble, suspecting him of having someone else. During one of their arguments, somehow, Tanya lost the baby. By the way, my friend suddenly asked, did you know Elvis faints at the sight of blood? Elvis faints at the sight of blood? I've known him for 2 lifetimes and never knew that. When Tanya had a miscarriage, she bled heavily and Elvis fainted at the sight of the blood. When he woke up, everyone said he had changed. Hearing this, my heart sank. It seems my guess was right. Maybe Elvis Sutphin, like me, was reborn. The overseas investor I met at the party last time is hosting a banquet in North City soon. I begged my dad to get me an invitation. My dad looked at me meaningfully and said, Garrett is very familiar with that foreigner. Why don't you just ask him to take you? I don't want to bother him. My dad glanced at me and said softly, he would be more than happy to be bothered by you. Suddenly, I remembered the day I asked Garrett if he liked me. He was silent for a long time before he said softly, you just realized? Why is your face so red? My dad touched my forehead. It's getting colder. Don't catch a cold. After saying this, he got up and prepared to go upstairs. I stopped him. Dad, did you ask Garrett to come back?
My dad shook his head.
I just told him that your engagement was off, and he immediately booked a flight back. That night, I received a call from Garrett. Your dad said you want to go to Mr. Hobbs' banquet. Thinking about everything that had happened, I felt a bit awkward hearing his voice on the phone. After a muffled response, Garrett said, do you need me to pick you up tomorrow? His low, husky voice through the phone made my whole body tingle. I declined. No, I can go by myself. After a moment of silence, just as I was about to hang up, I suddenly heard Garrett call my name. Cecily. The way he said this word always sent a shiver down my spine. You said you would consider me. Had you thought about it? I felt like a cat whose tail had been stepped on and hurriedly hung up the phone. At that time, I just said that to brush him off, but Garrett took it seriously. While waiting outside for Garrett, I ran into Elvis. I turned my head, pretending not to see him, but Elvis approached me without hesitation. Cecily, you've come back too, haven't you? Even though I had already guessed it, hearing him say it still felt unbelievable. Elvis's smile was a bit dim.
He said,
you hate me, don't you? Without waiting for my response, he continued talking. I'm sorry, I misunderstood you in our last life after you died. I found out that Tanya took money from my mom to leave. From the beginning, she only approached me for money. Cecily. Elvis looked at me with deep affection. I'm sorry. Can you forgive me one more time? Let's start over in this life. Be my wife again, and give me a chance to make it up to you. I stared at Elvis's hypocritical face and said calmly, no. Why should I forgive you? Elvis's face showed even more sadness. After Tanya appeared in our last life, didn't you forgive me once? Cecily, why not this time? You like me, don't you? You've always liked me. So what? Does my liking mean I deserve to be mistreated? Cecily. Garrett's voice came from above my head. It wasn't until he draped a coat over my shoulders that I realized my body was trembling slightly from the sudden warmth. Why are you waiting outside in such cold weather? Garrett asked, ignoring Elvis and showing his concern for me. I smiled, looking up at him. Didn't you have something to do today? Why did you still come? As he passed by Elvis, Garrett glanced at him. I was worried you'd be bothered by someone inexplicable. After saying that, he took me inside at the banquet. Elvis stayed close to that overseas investor. From a distance, I watched the smile on his face and guessed he probably had reached an agreement. When Elvis noticed my gaze and looked over, I sipped my wine. Even I didn't realize my lips were curved upwards. What are you smiling at, Cecily? Garrett suddenly asked me. He had been by my side all evening, so none of my small actions escaped his notice. Garrett rubbed his fingers together and whispered, I thought you came to make sure Elvis didn't succeed. Suddenly, his mood turned somber. Even his gaze on me became darker. Cecily, you still can't let him go, can you? Do you still like Elvis Sutphin? As expected, in the end, Elvis's parents came to ask my dad for help. That overseas investor isn't full. He wouldn't just throw billions at Elvis based on a few words. They want financing, but where can we find that much money now? In law, only you can save our family. My dad had a stern face. Mr. Sutphin, our families have already canceled the engagement. Let's not call each other in-laws anymore. As for what you mentioned, let me think about it for 2 days. After sending them off, my dad asked me, if you still like Elvis, I will find a way to help them. But Cecily, you need to think it through. I've lived 2 lifetimes, and it seems everyone thinks I'm deeply in love with Elvis. But I know myself, I don't have such deep feelings for him. I took a sip of water and persuaded my dad to agree to them. Since the Sutphin family is failing, we should spend some money to acquire the Sutphin group. This way, all the hard-earned investments Elvis has been seeking will become my stepping stone. They will agree. There are few people in North City capable of taking over now. If they don't agree, The Sutphin family will have to declare bankruptcy and bear huge debts. My dad was stunned. He asked me, "Since when did you become so knowledgeable about business matters?" I smiled without explaining much. "Our Cecily has really grown up," my dad said while wiping his tears. "I'm relieved you can let go of Elvis," he said earnestly. "That overseas investor is Garrett's friend. Even he thought you would save the Sutphin family because of Elvis." I suddenly realized I hadn't seen Garrett for a long time. At the last party, he seemed to have misunderstood something. He left without giving me a chance to explain, only having his driver take me home. "Cecily," my dad called me. "If you don't like Elvis anymore, would you consider Garrett? Dad will tell you today. Garrett has liked you for many years. He insisted on staying in North City to finish high school because of you. After the college entrance exams, you got together with that Sutphin boy, so he went abroad." I was stunned for a moment. In high school, someone did say Garrett liked me, but I didn't believe it at the time. Not only because I had an engagement with Elvis, but also because I always thought someone as perfect as Garrett couldn't possibly like anyone. He shouldn't have any worldly desires, always standing at the pinnacle with a pure heart. Back then, I probably deified Garrett. "Did you and Garrett have a fight?" my dad suddenly asked. I didn't say anything. In the evening, my parents were out for some reason and hadn't come back. When the doorbell rang, I thought it was them returning, but the person standing outside was Garrett. He looked a bit anxious, holding a bag, clearly having come straight from the company. "Why are you here? Your parents said you were sick." We spoke at the same time. After understanding the situation, Garrett and I exchanged a smile. When he was about to leave, I called him Garrett. Garrett turned around, looking at me, waiting for what I had to say next. "That day you asked me if I still liked Elvis." I paused. "I'm answering you now. I don't like him. Not at all." My dad was right. It's been getting colder lately. So when Garrett suddenly rushed over to hug me, I found his embrace so warm. "Why?" Explain to me. His head was buried in my neck, his voice muffled as he spoke. "Because I don't want you to misunderstand. The day we signed the contract with the Sutphin family, Mr. and Mrs. Sutphin looked at the contract and refused to sign it. Elvis stared at me in silence for a long time before finally signing the contract. As he handed me the signed contract, he asked, after signing the contract, "Can we put our past behind us?" Only he and I knew he was referring to what he did to me and my family in our previous lives. Elvis believed that since he maliciously annexed my company in our past life, and I took advantage of the situation to acquire his family's company in this life, we were now even. I smiled and put away the contract without answering. As I was about to leave, Elvis stopped me. "Cecily, I was really wrong. Will you give me another chance? Wait for me to make a comeback, and we can get engaged again." Before he could finish, Garrett had already walked in. Garrett greeted my father with a smile and then said, "I'm here to take Cecily to try on the dress." My father nodded quickly and let us go about our business. As we reached the door, I heard my father say to Mr. Sutphin, "Our Cecily is getting engaged to Garrett. We hope you can come to the engagement party." Upon hearing this, Elvis suddenly went crazy and rushed out to stop Garrett and me. "Cecily, you can't get engaged to him. What right does he have to marry you?" I said, "Because he is a good match for me." "Elvis, after today, you won't even have the right to appear in front of me anymore." When I saw the trending news about Elvis, Garrett and I were still at our engagement party. #Tanya Kern's body found. #police have evidence of Elvis Sutphin's murder. #Elvis Sutphin arrested and imprisoned. After knowing that Elvis had been reborn, I guess he wouldn't let Tanya go. So I had been secretly searching for her whereabouts. "What are you doing here?" Garrett found me outside the villa. He glanced at my high heels. "Are you tired?" I shook my head. "It's too stuffy inside. I came out for some fresh air." But Garrett still held my waist and lifted me to sit on the handrail of the corridor. "Wait here for me." When he came back, Garrett had a box in his hand. As I was guessing what was inside, he had already opened it in front of me. Inside was a pair of exquisitely crafted leather shoes. Garrett bent down to put them on me. The shoes were soft leather, very fitting and comfortable. "When did you buy them?" I asked him. Garrett smiled, his tone very light. I thought they would look great on you when I saw them, so I bought them. His gaze lingered on my feet, but his smile deepened. After all these years, I finally have the chance to put them on you myself. Later, when I went abroad with Garrett to sort out his things, I realized he was telling the truth. In his villa, apart from a bedroom and a study, every other room was filled with things he had bought for me over the years. There were precious jewels, exquisite dresses, high heels, and many expired lipsticks.
Why didn't you send them to me?
I asked him when I saw those things. Garrett smiled and took out a gemstone necklace from the display cabinet, putting it on me himself. Back then, I thought you liked someone else. His voice was a bit hoarse, so I didn't dare to disturb you. It was clear Garrett was trying hard to conceal his sadness. I stepped forward and hugged his waist. Mr. Black, please feel free to disturb me more in the future. Garrett pulled me into his arms. I heard his clear voice in my ear with a hint of a smile. He replied, "All right, Mrs. Black."